Good morning, everyone. It's Dr. Wiebrecht here, trying to continue our conversation about race and myths and dispelling some of these versus reality. I think it's important that we begin to look at some of these concepts a little bit more in detail. I think what we begin to see is that a lot of people think that humankind can be sorted into biologically distinct groups called races. And that idea begins to suggest that there are pure examples of different races and that any person can belong to only one race, which we know that we have individuals with multiple backgrounds. And so when we begin to look at this a little bit more closely, we can begin to see that biologists, geneticists, and even social scientists reject that view of race. And not only that, but we also see that all people belong to the human species. And so when we begin to see this, we can see that there are greater differences actually occurring within racial groups than between racial groups. And just to sort of recanvas some of our conversations from the past discussion, we begin to see that, racial differences become very important because we as a society have believed that they are important in a sense. So in sociological terms, when we talk about the concept of race, this is, shareable, observable, physical characteristics. And we as a society distinguish that into a particular group of people. Okay. What's interesting is that in today's day and age, we have a obviously very multiracial country that we live in. And a lot of these features begin to look at how these racial and ethnic groups are not as black and white as what we like to think in a sense when it comes to particular categories. And we can begin to see that in the census that that individuals are having to now complete. And it begs the question, is that even important anymore? Should we even necessarily look at race, and how people identify that on their census responses? Is it something that we should even have to categorize? We talked about ethnicity, and I want you guys to sort of recap and so you understand that ethnicity is that set of cultural characteristics that distinguishes one group from another group. So people who share a common cultural background and a common sense of identity are known as an ethnic group. Ethnicity is based on those characteristics such as national origin, religion, language, customs, and values. And we know that ethnic groups pass that on through their cultural beliefs and practices from generation to generation. So that ethnic identity can begin to cross racial or national boundaries. And not only that, but we see that those are based on cultural traits, right? While race on the other side is looking at those physical traits. So ethnicity, again, is we're looking at those cultural traits. Race, we're looking at those physical traits. Now, we had talked a little bit about ethnicity, but I want to emphasize something called ethnic work. Ethnic work references the concept that these are the ways in which people demonstrate or disperse some of their cultural heritage in a sense, right? We can see that in some of these pictures below where it's the language that they use, the dress, the food, the dancing, different things. Maybe it's a ring dance of the Native Americans. Maybe it's, a particular activity that's passed down from generation to generation as a part of that culture. And so that becomes really important when we begin to look at how that can begin to piece somebody's sense of identity. Figure 9.1 is a really good example because we can see that if you have a low sense of ethnic identity, right, they're going to maybe feel more part of the majority, maybe feel like they have greater power, but they're similar to that national identity, but maybe they don't even feel like there's any discrimination because they're so much attached to the larger whole. Where if you begin to slide up that upscale part of it, you begin to see that here they have a much heightened sense. They have a knowledge that they are, in a sense, believe that they are ethnically different, and so they're smaller numbers, lesser power. May they feel they're different from that national identity, and in a sense, maybe they feel that there's some discrimination that begins to occur as a result of that. So that figure is really important as we begin to dissect that. Some of these other pictures are other examples of ethnic work. So we begin to see the Czech community in Nebraska, again, doing some ancestry work where maybe they're showing the community a little bit more about their culture. The same goes for the Native Americans in Colorado where they're doing a powwow. And we see this. Johnstown has the Polk Festival. We also have, there's times when I've gone out to Idlewild or Kennywood and I've seen different groups out there doing different dances, doing different food as part of that. One in particular was the Native Americans to show what that culture was in our community and how that looked. And so that's really important because that's passed on from generation to generation. And that's how we begin to disperse and begin to keep those traditions alive, in a sense. All right. I think we need to have a conversation about the difference between discrimination and prejudice. These are both very common features of minority groups that tend to have experiences worldwide. And that discrimination can occur at a societal level as legal discrimination and institutional discrimination as well. And so we want to begin to decipher that a little bit more. Prejudice, on the other hand, is supported by the use of stereotypes, simplified, exaggerated, and unfavorable generalizations about groups of people.